March 5644, 2300 hours over northern Burma at Vuz 200 feet. The night was a velvet heat broken only by the slow blink of fireflies and the distant glow of cooking fires. Silence felt like a weapon. Behind a C-47 Dakota, a Waco CG-4A, steel tube, wood and fabric, wings 83 feet across, rode the tow at 120 miles per hour. Its two pilots peering into blackness and the faint wink of a Eureka beacon somewhere beyond the Salween haze. The jungle swallowed light. On the headset, a calm American voice from 1st Air Commando Group read the change. Piccadilly obstructed. Divert to Broadway. And the words turned the whole assault with one breath, while the taw lines thrummed like harp strings in the hot wind. A code name became a fate. The British called the Waco the Hadrian, and this one carried 13 Chendits and a small Clarkar. CEA-1 bulldozer lashed nose to tail, everything tied down with web strap and hope. Weight creaked in the dark. The tow pilot flashed his Aldis lamp, and the glider crew counted to 3, pulled the release, and felt the rope whip away into the night as their world became the hush of air over fabric and the faint clatter of loose kit. Sound drained out. A pilot's hand settled on the spade grip, thumb resting on a dead switch that wasn't needed. Eyes on a dimmed panel and a descending needle, while the jungle rose like a breathing wall. Time narrowed to seconds. Rebecca reading steady lights ahead. The glider's co-pilot whispered, meaning the tiny lanterns laid by pathfinders on a clearing called Broadway. A swath of elephant grass and termite mounds too rough to be called a strip. Faith leaned forward. Below, Brigadier Mike Calvert's men waited in shadows with very pistols, the signal to widen the landing ground trapped behind discipline, because noise risked everything until the first skids touched. Patience tasted like copper. The Waco slipped the last trees by feet and flared blind, its skids hissing in dry grass, before the nose wheel snapped and the fuselage bucked hard enough to bite tongues. Behind the pilot's seats, men locked elbows and braced for the second bounce. Impact stole breath. A glider farther down the lane hit a log and folded like a matchbox, its fuselage cracking open in dust and shouts and the skirl of torn canvas, and for a moment that clearing flickered with torches and fear. Cost arrived early. Glider down, bulldozer intact, bringing it out. A British sapper's voice cut the chaos on a handset, the first practical sentence of the night, as the Kia-1's little engine coughed to life and rolled into darkness to push wreckage aside. Utility was salvation. In the tow stream behind them, more CG-4As ghosted in. Scores launched from India behind Dakotas flown by Cochrane's and Allison's 1st Air Commandos. Each one a wooden whisper over a black jungle. Each one a bet that silence could outfly surprise. The sky made promises. Released at one's 200 feet, Elzey rough, numerous obstacles. Strip under improvement. A dry entry would read in an after-action note that could not possibly contain the stink of battery acid, sweat, and crushed grass. Paper hid the night. On the first wave's rim, a pathfinder carried his lamp twice, and then 3 times, the pre-arranged welcome to men who had trained in chalk-striped deserts and now aimed for a field named after London's theatre district. Absurdity felt normal. The men inside the Wacos, Chendits from the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade and British airmen with cloth caps stiff as bark, stared through canvas light and felt the jungle's heat like an extra weight on their harness. Breath turned loud. The Waco was a simple creature. No engine, just lift and nerve. Yet its boxy belly could swallow a jeep or a pack howitzer. And tonight it carried the first tools to turn a rough patch called Broadway into a runway. Design served intent. Broadway open. The message finally went out in clipped wireless to India. The 2 words that unlocked the next act as Dakotas stacked above the black canopy waiting for permission to bring in men and mules by the hundred. Relief rode static. On another approach, a glider clipped a stump and cartwheeled into darkness, and the explosion of sound was followed by a quiet that made the other crews grip the stick harder, as if steady hands could bargain with terrain. Luck kept score. A Chindit officer crawled out of a torn side panel with blood on his boots and dirt in his teeth, shouted, "Get that dozzer over here!" and pointed with a torch at a shattered wing the bulldozer nosed aside like paper. Urgency felt righteous. In the distance, a Japanese outpost heard nothing but night insects and thought the jungle undisturbed, unaware that an airfield was being born beneath their map lines by men who had landed without a sound. Surprise stayed perfect. Never thought you could land a glider in a jungle, a Dakota pilot would say later in a mess tent in Assam, shaking his head at the memory as if it were somebody else's dare. A new rule had been written. The first C-47 came in before dawn, wheels kissing earth that had not been an airstrip hours earlier, and the men who had wrestled gliders into grass watched prop wash flatten elephant grass into lanes. Momentum took over. By sunrise the clearing was scarred and serviceable, wrecked Waco stacked at the edges, Pathfinder lamps cold, bulldozer tracks scoring dark arcs through pale dust. The jungle had a runway. Somewhere beyond the teak line, a Japanese battalion staff officer folded his morning map and reported the area quiet, the absence of engine noise supporting a conclusion the night had already made false. Assumptions held firm. The Waco had arrived as a rumour until it scraped the skin from the earth and delivered a bulldozer, a radio, and a brigade. And in those hush black hours over Burma, Japan never feared a wooden glider, until the silent Wacos landed behind their lines. Burma in early 1944 was a web of ridges and rivers where roads dissolved at the first monsoon and armies starved on maps. The Japanese 15th Army pressing toward India, while Allied columns probed jungle tracks that swallowed trucks whole. Terrain dictated fate. Ord Wingate returned from London with a mandate to try again. His long-range penetration. Brigades would not sneak and fade. They would intrude and stay, living off air supply in fortified strongholds astride the Japanese rail and road net. Persistence became strategy. The men were a mosaic, British, Gurkha, and Indian soldiers under brigadiers like Mike Calvert and Bernard Ferguson. Trained to march at night, blow rails at dawn, and vanish before pursuit could gather. Endurance set the tone. At the Quebec Conference in 1943, Wingate told Allied leaders he could put brigades behind the lines if the air could carry the weight, and Hap Arnold answered by raising a bespoke tool, 1st Air Commando Group under Cole. Philip Cochrane and Elty Cole. John Allison. Air would be the spine. Their kit was a strange orchestra C-47s for tow and lift, Waco CG-4A gliders for silent landings, P-551As for cover, B-25s for strikes, L-1s and L-5s for liaison, even R-4 helicopters for rescue trials. Innovation crowded the field. The Waco looked humble, steel tube, wood and doped fabric, but its belly could swallow a Jeep, a 75 mm pack howitzer, or a 5,000-pound Clark Air CA-1 bulldozer, and land it where no runway had ever been. Simplicity hid force. Wingate's plan for operation. Thursday named 3 landing zones: Piccadilly, Broadway, and Chowringhe. Clearings deep in the teak and elephant grass that pathfinders would mark with Eureka beacons for. Rebecca. Sets in the towing Dakotas. Code names became compass points. The mission was to insert the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade first, then expand into strongholds, White City, at Morloo and Blackpool, farther east, to cut the Mandalay-Mitina rail line and choke Japanese logistics feeding the U. Go offensive toward Imphal and Kohima. Disruption was the aim. On the Japanese side, Lenti Gen. Renya Mutaguchi's 15th Army and elements of the 18th Division believed the interior safe from massed air landings. The jungle and distance seemed to forbid them, and gliders sounded like novelties unsuited to teak and termite mounds. Assumption felt solid. Intelligence cuts were thin, the terrain ill-mapped, and Japanese staff officers leaned on a principle that had held so far. That enemies could infiltrate but not sustain, that deep raiders were a rash to be scratched, not surgery to be endured. Confidence ran quiet. Allied planners rid those habits and gambled on surprise and silence, drilling night tows and dead stick landings, rehearsing bulldozer offloads until crews could free a Chi-1 from a smashed nose in minutes. Practice became insurance. Piccadilly obstructed. Came the last-minute word on March 5. A photo showing logs laid across the clearing, whether by chance or compromise never proved, and Cochrane diverted the whole train to Broadway, without pausing to argue. Flexibility saved the night. Broadway under improvement. Strip serviceable by dawn. A Chindit signal would later report. A dry line that meant gliders had hit logs. Skids had torn canvas, and sappers had dragged a bulldozer out of a cracked fuselage to shove wreckage into the brush. Grit turned into runway. John Allison said later what pilots had felt in their bones. Glider is the most dangerous airplane ever built. And yet he and Cochrane chose it for the first bite, because nothing else could land a bulldozer silently in a jungle clearing at midnight. Risk met resolve. Japanese outposts around Morlu heard no engines and saw no flares, and dawn found a Sito-47 on its wheels in a place where an airstrip had not existed the evening before. The first shuttles unloading men, mules, radios, and more fuel than any patrol had ever carried overland. Surprise held. The stakes ran beyond one clearing. If the strongholds took root, the rail at Morlu and bridges feeding indoor would be cut, and the U-Go push into India would fight with a severed artery while Allied columns received ammunition, rations, and reinforcements from the sky. Strategic blood would drain for Japan. A successful Allied air insertion would force a new kind of counterattack. Columns turning to face a welt supplied force in their rear, while still driving on Imphal and Kohima, with their own supply lines stretched across rivers that swelled with early rains. Pressure would split fronts. For the Allies, failure meant more than broken gliders. It meant brigades stranded amid teak without airfields, men and mules bleeding out under a canopy that hid the enemy and muffled friendly engines. The jungle would take everything. Technology gave each side a character. The Allies trusted Rebecca Eureka homing, VHF control from India, and bulldozers that could invent runways. The Japanese trusted terrain, interior lines, and an instinct that night belonged to those who already held the ground. Tools reflected doctrine. In mess tents at Lalajat and Hailakandi, pilots studied faded photographs of clearings and traced tow speeds with pencils, while Chendits learned which straps to cut first, when a glider shed its nose, and everyone measured success in minutes between touchdown and the first shovel of earth. Preparation smelled of oil and dust. On staff maps in Mamio and Indore, Japanese officers marked usual British patrols and filed Broadway's coordinates under quiet, because the night had not announced itself, and the jungle had kept its own counsel. Silence missiled. The opening move of Operation Thursday mattered, because it flipped the logic of the theatre. Armies would not merely steal across rivers. They would arrive by air into the middle of the enemy's map, and stay. A new grammar entered the war. And when a wooden glider could carry a bulldozer to a place with no name, and make it into a runway before the first bird call, the balance between daring and disbelief began to shift. The setup was complete. The Waco CG-4A looked like a shed with wings. Steel tube fuselage, plywood ribs, and doped fabric stretched tight over an 83-foot span, a blunt nose hinge to swing up and swallow cargo whole. Utility war canvas. Inside that boxy belly lived its secret 13 troops and kit, or a Willys Jeep, or a 75 Memendres pack howitzer, or roughly 5,000 pounds of Clark Air C1 bulldozer with the blade stowed, each tied down to floor rings that creaked under strain. Capacity became shock. Empty, it weighed barely 2 tons. At a gross near 7,500 pounds, it still flew clean. 60-70 miles on approach, 120 miles behind a Dakota, and a last silent minute that stretched forever over jungle when the tow rope snapped free. Silence replaced thrust. The cockpit was bare honesty. 2 seats, a spade grip, a few gauges glowing dim, a hand-cranked trim wheel, and the pilots wore the airplane more than they sat in it, feeling every gust through wood and wire. Nerves became instruments. Steel skids and a small nose wheel took the ground in a hiss and a bang, shock cords doing more prayer than physics, when the strip turned out to be termite mounds and logs under grass. Impact had a voice. "A glider is the most dangerous airplane ever built," John Allison said later, not as complaint but as praise for the one machine that could put a bulldozer into a clearing without warning a sentry a mile away. Risk was part of the design. Tow was its lifeline, a C-47 hauling hundreds of feet of nylon or manila rope at 120 miles. The line thrumming like a violin string in warm night air, while the glider sat steady in the wake's quiet pocket. Trust lived in tension. At the release point, often 1,000 to 1,500 feet, the Waco slipped free, the pilots easing nose and rudder to trade height, for reach toward a triangle of lanterns and a wavering bloom on the Rebecca set. Judgment replaced noise. Rebecca Eureka was the night's compass. Rebecca, an airborne interrogator in the tow ship, calling Eureka, a ground beacon. Answering. Pulsar-coded pips on a scope, and in headphones that led a black wingtip to 3 tiny lights someone risked his life to place. Electrons guided courage. Rebecca steady, Eureka strong. A Dakota navigator would murmur, and that quiet confidence walked a glider down a line the jungle could not draw on any map. The sky carried the path. The CG-4A's hind nose made doctrine practical land, swing the front open, back a Jeep out or drive a Key A1 forward, and turn a rough patch into a strip with a growl of low horsepower that felt like a miracle after an hour of wind. Mechanics made strategy. The little high I-1 weighed about 5,000 pounds, narrow-tracked and simple, and its first tasks at Broadway were brutal and brilliant. Shove wrecked gliders to the side, level termite mounds, and cut ruts into runways a Dakota could risk. Earthwork became lifeline. Doctrine wrapped that engineering in Wingate's vision. Long-range penetration, strongholds supplied entirely by air. So the Waco was not a stunt, but a keystone. The only way to land heavy tools in a place the enemy believed unreachable. A tool became doctrine. Operation Thursday's choreography reflected it. Pathfinder parties in first, Eureka hidden at the edge, lanterns laid in lanes, CPU-47s towing pairs of Wacos across the Solween at night, each glider carrying a piece of an airfield that did not yet exist. Assembly began in darkness. Combat reports kept the tone the pilots preferred. Released at 200 feet, LZ rough, numerous obstacles. Strip under improvement, because the machine's personality demanded understatement to keep hands steady on the stick. Calm guarded focus. The first wave proved both the promise and the price. Many Wacos landed safe, many broke. Some folded around obstacles. And the only numbers that mattered by dawn were the count of bulldozers running, and the width of the stripper Dakota's tires. Could accept. Outcome trumped Tolly. Cochrane and Allison's first Air Commando group built an ecosystem around the glider. Pier 51As to slash at threats. B-25s to maul roadblocks, L-1s and L-5s to hop wounded out of small strips, and even the frail Waco 4 helicopter that would lift casualties from tight jungle pockets for the first time in war. Air became anatomy. On the ground, Brigadier Mike Calvert's-Chenditz gave the glider a voice. Sappers staged ramp planks and sling chains. Riflemen secured the perimeter in the first minutes, and signalers keyed, Broadway open. In the same breath they asked for more fuel and mules. Procedure met panic. Japanese doctrine had no slot for any of this. It assumed terrain as ally and silence as absence, not as method, and the Waco converted that assumption into a flank that appeared fully formed by sunrise. Belief found a blind spot. The British designation, Hadrian, fit the machine's Roman mood undramatic, stubborn, a builder by arrival. Its fabric smelling of dope and sweat as crews dragged its wrecks aside to make room for the next landing. Labour felt ancient. Tie-downs, floor plates, hinge pins, and quick-release straps became the new ordnance, and the checklists glider crews recited in Assam huts. Blades stowed, jeep fuel off. Dozer lashings cut in order, were as lethal in effect as a bomb line when the aim was to grow an airfield under an enemy's nose. Logistics turned offensive. It was not a precision machine. It was a promise kept by hands and judgment, by a tow pilot's steady throttle and a glider pilot's quiet nerve when the lanterns seemed too close and the trees too tall. Character mattered most. And when it worked, as it did at Broadway, the Waco's character became the theatre's, a quiet insistence that what could not be reached by road could be reached by fabric and will. The wooden glider made doctrine audible in the hush. March 5 to 6, 1944, 23:30 hours, the tow lines hummed over teak and elephant grass as the diverted stream slid toward a clearing no one had walked at noon. The night chose a stage. Piccadilly obstructed, divert to Broadway, the message had said, and the entire assault bent on one sentence, while the jungle lay black and unsuspecting under warm air. Assurance met improvisation. First in were the pathfinders, Eureka hidden and lamps in hand, men crouched at the edges of a field that was not a field at all. Termite mounds like boulders, logs under grass, and a tree line too close for comfort. Silence earned a runway. The gliders began to slip free, a Waco at Furs 200 feet let go, floated like a box kite into dark, and flared where someone's lantern winked 3 times through heat, haze and nerves. Hope rode fabric. One hit smooth and hissed to a halt. One struck a stump and buckled. Another tore a skid and folded a wing with a scream of canvas and splinters that sounded like a tearing map. Luck kept score. Bulldozer intact. Bringing it out. Crackled a British sapper on a handset moments later, practical and breathless, as a Clark Harvey I-1 coughed awake inside a cracked fuselage and nosed down the ramp into grass. Utility trumped shock. It chugged like a toy and worked like a prophecy, pushing wrecked Wacos aside, shaving termite mounds, and carving 2 stripes out of rough earth, while more gliders surfed the tree line and gambled their loads on inches. Muscle turned chaos into plan. A pilot's after-action line was dry to the point of parody, released at Funds 200 theft, LZ rough, numerous obstacles, strip under improvement. But out on Broadway the air smelled of hot dope, torn grass, and sweat, and men swore softly as if the jungle could hear. Paper could not hold heat. In the tow stream, pairs of CG-4As ghosted past faint constellations of oil lamps, each one a quiet argument against every staff neatness that had said a glider belonged to grass plains and quiet fields. Doctrine found an edge. Some broke hard, noses snapping, skids digging, loads shifting forward with the momentum of a thrown house. And medics and riflemen pulled men clear, while sappers lit hooded lanterns and flagged the bulldozer toward the next obstruction. The price arrived quickly. Broadway open. Went the signal up to India, while the key A1 clanked in a slow circle, and somewhere in a dim operations room a pencil underlined the words, and a green lamp went steady. 2 words moved fleets. Before dawn. A Dakota's silhouette loomed on approach, wheels tucked, flaps down. The sound of Pratt and Whitney's a heresy in that hush until tires kissed a strip that had not existed when the first Waco let go. Noise felt like proof. Men and mules spilled out, fuel drums rolled, crates thumped onto dirt, and the first shuttle leapt away into growing light, while on the edge of the field wreckage lay piled like a line of fallen trees. Momentum outran doubt. Out beyond the teak, a Japanese company outpost noted nothing unusual, no engines, no flarers, and the routine morning report marked the grid square, quiet, the very word that was already untrue. Assumption wrote itself. A Chindit officer, filthy and grinning through blood and dust, barked, "Get that dozer over here," at a jammed glider nose, and then keyed a handset without ceremony. Broadway operational. Send the rest. Calm spent like currency. Gliders kept coming, some to Charing-He, some to the new strip, and every landing widened the lane. Every disaster fed the bulldozer, and every safe roll-out meant another jeep or radio or gun, where no road would ever run. Each arrival multiplied. John Allison's line. A glider is the most dangerous airplane ever built. Hung in the background like a dare fulfilled, because the very danger had bought the one thing doctrine said could not be bought in Burmese silence at the point of arrival. Risk paid in surprise. At street level of the night, it looked like handwork. Sappers with pickets, pilots with cutters, pathfinders with lamps. But at altitude the turning point read simpler, a C-47 on wheels behind enemy lines before dawn. Symbol overtook detail. By first light, Mike Calvert stood in a strip of flattened grass and named a base, Broadway. Then pointed down the rail line toward Morlu, where a stronghold would become, White City, and ordered columns to move. Intention found ground. Japanese staff maps would be updated too late. The idea of a quiet centerline replaced by a reality that brigades had arrived where only patrols were supposed to creep, and an airfield had been built by men who'd landed without engines. A blind spot turned fatal. Broadway open. The net repeated. Plain words that turned a wooden glider from a curiosity into a key, and a jungle clearing into a runway with the weight of strategy on it. The hinge clicked. Arrogance. That nothing heavy could land in teak at midnight. That silence meant absence. Met a field of wreckage and a working bulldozer. Reality spoke with skids and blade. By dawn on March 6, Broadway's rough scar was taking C-47s, and Wingate's brigades fanned out in columns to bite the Mandalay, Myitkyina rail at Morlu and lay mines on roads that had never feared an enemy behind them. Momentum felt improbable. White City established. Rail cut. A Chindit signal flashed on the 24th of March, the shorthand for a fortified block of wire trenches, 75 Munneris pack howitzers, and VHF sets calling in air drops like clockwork. A stronghold grew teeth. Japanese battalions probed first and then hit in mass. Night infiltrations and daylight assaults with knee mortars and 75s, convinced that a jungle fort could be crushed if pressed hard enough. Assurance met wire. They found a new rhythm instead. Supply parachutes blooming on schedule, Vickers and Bren's talking from Sangars, and Peli 51As from the 1st Air Commando strafing approach lanes that scouts had marked by compass and habit. Counterattack met air. Broadway serviceable, Charing-He soft, an early report admitted. The second strip proving boggy and treacherous while bulldozers and sappers shifted effort to widen the main runway and carve a third field called Aberdeen. Flexibility replaced pride. At White City the Chindits fought like a gate across the railway, stopping trains, blowing rails, and ambushing repair gangs until the timetable that fed Go into India began to stutter. Logistics started to bleed. Calvert's men wrote their days in lines that hide as much as they say. Repulsed attack 0300. Heavy casualties to enemy. Ammunition drop received 0630. Road cut again 0900, because the grind left no space for adjectives. Endurance muted drama. Japanese columns adapted, they skirted deeper into teak, set obstacles on likely clearings, and walked at night where the jungle seemed to guarantee privacy, drawing maps that assumed gliders would not come twice. Assumptions learned limits. The Allies answered with repetition. More Wacos when needed, more C-47 shuttles, more CI-1s to turn grass into lanes, and a doctrine that turned silence and dirt into airfields faster than any staff note could forbid them. Method built courage. Helicopters arrived as a whisper of the future, LT. Carter Harmon's IRR-4 lifting wounded out of tight jungle pockets in April 1944, in the first combat medevac flights on record. The rotor's thwack, a new sound among cicadas. Innovation saved lives. Drop complete, no enemy movement observed. Returning, a Mustang pilot reported after a low pass over Morlu. A tidy sentence that stood in for the feeling of trees flashing past wingtips and tracers snapping in the green. Com hid risk. By April, Aberdeen ran like a forward depot. Mules, jeeps, water, fuel. Ammunition. While Broadway took heavier traffic and White City settled into the brutal trade of raids and repulse that starved the rail line of certainty. Supply made defiance possible. Farther north, Brigadier John Masters' 111th Brigade dug in at Blackpool, near Hopin in May. A second block laid across roads and tracks, just as the monsoon began to smear the land into mud. Another door slammed. Japanese units massed to crack it. Artillery creeping closer day by day, infiltrators cutting wire at night, and attacks hitting like a drum under rain until radio logs grew clipped and casualties climbed. Pressure found purchase. Enemy shelling continuous. Rations low, airstrip untenable. Blackpool signalled after weeks of holding. A sober cadence that led to evacuation by air and foot in late May, as the position finally gave to weight and weather. Not all bets held. White City held longer. The Mandalay-Mietkaina line choked for weeks, and the habit of air supply under fire turned from audacity to routine as pathfinders keyed Eureka, and the sky answered with rations and rounds. Normal rewrote fear. The Japanese adapted again. Posts sprouted on clearings, roadblocks multiplied, and patrols learned to listen for the absence of engines that meant trouble had already arrived. But each adaptation admitted that gliders and shuttles had redrawn what, for our, meant. Recognition carried dread. Chandit columns pushed on to Mogong through June under Calvert, taking the town at terrible cost in a joint grind with Merrill's marauders, a proof that bases born from glider lanes could sustain an advance that boots alone never would. Sacrifice bought ground. Air Commandos expanded their playbook. B-25s pounded bridges, Mustangs fenced with Ki 43s and Ki 44s, and liaison planes hopped casualties out of hacked strips that would have been footnotes without the first silent arrivals. Air wrapped the march. Glider landings in jungle, unexpected. A Japanese staff appreciation noted later, the understatement of an army that had treated trees and distance as armour, and now found radios and bulldozers living under the canopy. Surprise aged into respect. The jungle learned new sounds too, canvas tearing, dozer blades biting, parachute silk hissing in rain. And Japanese patrols moved with a new tension, pausing at clearings that no longer looked innocent in the half-light. Silence grew suspicious. Wingate's death in an air crash in late March did not unmake the doctrine. His brigades and the air commandos kept the pattern. Arrive silent, fortify, call the sky, and the enemy's counterattacks grew costlier as air and earth worked in concert. Ideas outlived the man. Behind every short signal lay the same simple reality. A wooden glider had made it possible to fight from the inside out in a theatre that had been ruled by rivers and roads. A fear took root. By the monsoon's height, both sides had adapted, but only one had learned to summon runways from grass in a night, and the other now measured quiet clearings as risks instead of refuge. Adaptation bred fear. By the second week of March, Broadway no longer looked like a scar, but like a moving machine, C-47s dropping on the numbers, while Wacos lay stacked at the edge like shed skins. Air had made a fortress. Sorties lay at dawn to dusk. Fuel rations, 75 dozen shells, wireless batteries, medical panniers, and every landing rolled a new certainty over teak that had never seen a runway. Rhythm replaced chance. White City established. Rail cut. Drops received on time. The signals read from Morlu as Brigadier Mike Calvert's men built a block that turned trains into wreckage and repair crews into targets. A schedule became a weapon. At Broadway, the CI droned without glamour, shaving termite mounds and widening lanes, while sappers flagged ruts. And the Dakota stream kept its promise, with wheels that kissed earth and lifted off again like punctuation. Continuity felt invincible. 1st Air Commando's P-5V-1As prowled low with Allison engines happy in thick air, strafing roadheads and columns, while B-25s shredded bridges with skip, bomb runs that made the riverbanks jump. Steel spoke for silence. Drop complete, 2 fires started on siding. Heavy flak light. A Mustang pilot recorded after a pass over Morlu. The understatement covering the way tracers stitched green through bamboo. Calm hid danger. At night, parachute canopies cracked open like ghost flowers above White City, bundles thumping into marked lanes while Vickers guns thudded and Bren snapped at shadows probing wire and ditches. Resupply met assault. Enemy formed up Zuo 300, repulsed, casualties heavy. A Chindit log noted, followed by the line that mattered more. Ammunition satisfactory. Staying power had a measure. Across the tracks. Japanese staff officers moved coloured pins to face the new fact. Strongholds that lived off air and would not melt at contact, and ordered battalions to attack into a geometry that no longer cared about roads. Doctrine met a wall. They hit White City hard. Knee mortars ticking like drums, 75s pinching the perimeter. Infiltration at night. But the first light always found fresh parachutes, and a fresh perimeter lit by very pistols. Effort met renewal. Chowring-He untenable. Aberdeen opened. The wireless crackled from the rear as sappers, and dozzers repeated the miracle, pushing a second strip into being while the first carried the weight. Flexibility doubled supply. By late March, the numbers went blunt. Thousands of men and animals delivered, hundreds of tons a week. Sorties counted in fat chalk on operations boards from Assam to Broadway, and the line of fear shifted from road to rail to sky. Scale crushed doubt. Cochrane and Allison's crews flew like clockwork and slept like thieves, P-51s orbiting strongholds, B-25s hammering bridges at Nobba and beyond, L1 and L5 grasshoppers skittering in to lift wounded from hacked lanes under white panels. Air wrapped the ground. LT. Carter Harmon's YR-04 helicopter thumped into the script in April, lifting wounded out of tight jungle pockets, across multiple sorties at the edge of its range, the first combat medevac by rotor in a war of wings. A whisper changed fate. Patient aboard. Power marginal. Departing. He radioed on one of those runs, a line as fragile and steady as the machine itself over trees that had never seen anything like it. Courage found new shape. Japanese companies learned to step softly at clearings that used to look harmless, listening to the absence of engines because it meant a strip might already exist and a perimeter might already be awake. Silence became threat. White City's block hurt the timetable, cutting the Mandalay Mayatkina rail for weeks and forcing supply columns into mud and night that could no longer be counted as sanctuary. Logistics bled in daylight, repairs attempted, destroyed again. A Japanese engineer diary laments beside a sketched curve of track and an angry set of arrows that point to nowhere useful without air. Frustration turned habitual. Not all the weight held. Blackpool near Hopin fought under rain and shellfire until May, when monsoon and mass cracked the position and evacuation came by air and through the green. A hard retreat written in names and stretcher tracks. Dominance still cost. But the method did not break. Broadway carried on. Aberdeen grew, columns pushed for Mogong with Merrill's marauders. And the air kept its delicate arithmetic of drums, bundles and gallons. Continuity outlived shocks. Supplies received as ordered, enemy attack repulsed. Runway serviceable. An evening Broadway report summarized while ground crews patched ruts by lamp and counted cylinders like rosary beads. Routine mask strain. Japanese units adapted with courage. Posts on likely LZs, ambushes for supply trails. Night assaults under rain. But every answer admitted that the idea of rear areas had been replaced by a map, where the enemy could arrive without engines. Recognition carried dread. By June the pattern was unmistakable. Gliders had made runways, runways had made strongholds, strongholds had made blocks, and blocks had reshaped the battle from the inside outward in a theatre that had been defined by distance. The circle closed. Men paid the tariff. Glider crews in torn canvas, chendits at rail cuts and roadblocks. Pilots in green alleys of tracer. And the jungle buried its dead without preference as the sky kept bringing the living back with water, salt, and rounds. Victory had a bill, in mess tents. Pilots said it with a shrug. Broadway still open. And in diaries soldiers wrote it with relief. Drops on time again. Two halves of a machine that had seized the initiative and refused to let it go. Ownership felt earned. The Japanese had not feared a wooden glider, and now they measured quiet clearings like mines, waiting for the next dawn when a Dakota would appear where no road led. The sky belonged to them. The wooden whisper in Burma was paid for in factories, depots, and schools that never slept. A supply chain running from Midwestern workshops to Assam clearings where dozer blades bit dirt before dawn. Scale fed silence. Across the United States, the CG-4A Waco glider rolled out by the tens of thousands of wings. Over 13,000 built by a web of firms that once made pianos, refrigerators, ladders and furniture, steel tubes jigged, plywood ribs glued, and doped fabric pulled drum tight under hot lamps. Industry wore canvas. C-47 Dakota production topped 10,000 airframes. Each a twin-engine promise, stamped at Douglas plants, and ferried along routes that curved toward India, where 1st Air Commando ground crews kept Pratt and Whitney's honest in heat and dust. Engines made endurance. Crated Wicos arrived as kits in theatre. Fuselage sections, wing panels, nose hinges, unboxed at Lalagat and Hailakandi, where riggers with pliers and patience turned piles of wood and wire into aircraft that could swallow a jeep or a 75 Mundren pack howitzer whole. Assembly became strategy. Packing sheds stacked CLE containers, cylinders of rations, small arms, medical panniers, each numbered and color-coded, each timed to a drop that would bloom above White City like clockwork flowers. Logistics learned to fall from the sky. Rebecca Eureka sets came in their own crates, valves and cabling labelled neat, ground beacons tested against airborne interrogators, until a pulse on a scope felt as familiar as a runway light at home. Electrons earned trust. Clark equipment shipped the Psi-1 bulldozer in pieces sized for gliders, frame, blade, power plant, so that a Waco could land the parts and a sapper could bolt them into a machine that changed a jungle's map in an hour. Tool met terrain. Training pipelines ran hot at stateside fields, USAF glider schools turning out thousands of pilots in bare cockpits, men who learned to read wind through fabric, and to flare by feel because Burma would demand it in the dark. Skill was manufactured. Released 1-200, LZ rough, strip under improvement, reads a Broadway log. One line among hundreds that depended on parachute packers, tying flawless knots and riggers wrapping shock cords that would hold a fuselage together for one more bounce. Routine hid risk. At Assam Depot's Air Service Command kept rails and roads busy. Avgas in 101 Thidioda-grade drums, spare props, magnetos, tires, spark plugs, and VHF radios, pushed forward by lorry under monsoon skies towards staging airfields that smelled of dust and hot oil. Supply outrun weather. 1st Air Commando Group itself was an engineered orchestra. 2 fighter squadrons in PA-51As, a medium bomber squadron in B-25s, transport squadrons in C-47s, liaison flights of L-AWAS and L-5S, and maintenance echelons that could swap a cylinder bank by lantern light. Organisation became tempo. Parachute sections worked like mills, chalking loads, bundling CLEs, and stowing static lines in racks that fed the next sortie by number and minute, while signallers kept nets clean so one phrase, Broadway open, could trigger a night of movement. Clockwork carried teeth. British workshops in India fabricated what shipping could not: chocks, sling chains, skid shoes, and glider pilot regiment vets on loan tutored crews in the small arts. How to cut lashings in order, how to brace a dozer in a bounce, how to keep men's boots clear of a swinging blade in dust and dark. Craft preserved lives. Drops received on time. Ammunition satisfactory. White cities reports repeated. Words that rested on parachute silk by the acre and aircraft hours counted in thousands as Seeker-47s shuttled until their airframes ticked at night. Numbers held nerve. In coastal depots, RAF and USAAF radio shops soldered Rebecca Eureka sets and checked crystals against humidity, because a weak beacon meant a missed lane, and a missed lane meant wreckage or worse. Precision resisted heat. The industrial echo reached the enemy as absence. Trains that did not arrive. Bridges that fell twice in a week. Columns that burned under Peter 51 fire, where maps had assumed safety. And Japanese staff officers wrote new orders that admitted the rear had turned porous. Output change doctrine. Glider landings in jungle. Unexpected. A Japanese appreciation noted later, terse as a stamp. While their engineers scrounged timbers to block clearings, and their patrols learned to fear lantern glows where none should be. Respect followed shock. Cochrane and Allison fed the beast with scheduling, chalk lists, tow plans, rearm refuel cycles, printed and reprinted on boards that lived beside coffee rings and weather notes. Each line a promise the system had to keep in rain or dark. Discipline became fuel. Even the future arrived on a freight docket. Sikorsky YR-4 helicopters crated and uncrated for trial, rotors balanced by feel. Engines coaxed to lift a wounded man over trees, because the machine and the moment finally matched. Innovation kept pace. On paper the avalanche was tonnage. Sorties and airframes. On the ground it was bulldozer tracks and piles of broken gliders at the field's edge, all spent to buy a strip wide enough for one more Dakota at one more dawn. Expenditure measured success. Factories, schools, depots, and huts formed a single nervous system that could think at a map and act on a clearing, turning wood and fabric into a runway, and a runway into a base that starved a railway. Integration made power, and when that power ran at full stride, the quietest aircraft in theatre spoke the loudest sentence in strategy, because industry had taught silence how to arrive on time. An avalanche of steel carried a whisper to war. When the monsoon washed the dust from Broadway and White City, The clearing closed over with grass, and the jungle kept only the memory of canvas hissing and a bulldozer coughing in the dark. Silence held the story. Veterans remembered the small things. The smell of hot dope and crushed grass, the way a lantern winked 3 times through heat haze, the thud of a CLE container landing right where a tired man had hoped. Details outlived speeches. Chindit signals stayed as blunt as the men who sent them. Broadway open. White City established. Ammunition satisfactory. Phrases that carried a theatre's turn with the weight of routine. Understatement became legend. The Japanese wrote their own sober line in a later appreciation. Glider landings in jungle. Unexpected. A stamped truth that had arrived without engines and stayed long enough to cut a railway's throat. Respect replaced disbelief. Coast ran beneath the Triumph like a buried river. Blackpool fell to rain and shell. Disease thinned columns. An evacuation line sketched through teak told of feet that bled as much as bullets did. Victory carried a bill. At Mogong the price and the promise met. Michael Almand of 300x6 Gurkha rifles earned a Victoria Cross and died of wounds the next day, and rifleman Tulbahadur Pun fought into the town under fire for the same ribbon. Acts fed by supplies that fell like clockwork silk. Courage paid in full. Wingate died in a crash in March, and still the doctrine he argued for took root. Arrive by air, live off air, and fight from the inside out, because the apparatus he demanded had already taught men what could be done in a night. Ideas outlived the voice. John Allison's wry verdict held as epitaph and praise. A glider is the most dangerous airplane ever built, because danger was the coin that bought silence at the point of arrival, where noise would have killed the plan. Risk became method. Carter Harmon's little YRS-4 lifted the wounded out of green traps in April and wrote the first clear line of helicopter medevac into a war of wings. A whisper of the future born in a jungle that had once felt infinite. Innovation left a mark. The 1st Air Commando Group folded the lesson into a creed. Fighters, bombers, transports, liaison, and rotary all playing one score, and their patch might as well have read, any time, anywhere, for how they moved at night on bearings and nerve. Integration became identity. After the war, the Waco's fabric and wood seemed anachronism beside jets, and yet museums kept the shape. A CG-4A at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, silent under lights. A sister at the Silent Wings Museum in Texas, because absence was the point of the design. Memory favored quiet. Stand by one and the proportions feel honest. A hinge nose belly big enough for a Jeep. Ribs and wire that turned lift into logistics, and skids that promised no second chance if a stump was hiding under grass. Simplicity felt fearless. In Burma the grass reclaimed Broadway. White City vanished into map notes and memoir, and the rail line that had choked under parachute silk now lies in books where thread and arrows once traced its hurt. The jungle keeps its counsel. Airborne doctrine walked on without gliders. Helicopters took their role in Korea and Vietnam. Air assault became a language. And airhead turned from a daring noun into a planner's term. Yet the wooden ancestor's signature remained. A whisper wrote the grammar. Historians argue the arithmetic of effect and cost. Tonnage dropped versus men spent. Rails cut versus columns worn thin. But the line that matters most still sounds like a Chindit signal. Drops on time. Position held. Outcome trumped elegance. On the other side, Japanese diaries turned thoughtful, where the maps had once been sure. Roads that were never safe again. Clearings that looked like traps. And nights that no longer guaranteed privacy from the sky. Confidence grew careful. The Chindit took its name from the Chinthi, a guardian beast on Burmese temples, and the Waco served that guardian's work by arriving as softly as a shadow to plant a gate across the enemy's lifeline. Symbol met function. What had been mocked as a toy, wood and wire in a theatre of rivers and monsoon, proved a key that unlocked a new front inside the old one, a wooden hinge that swung open under enemy noses before dawn. Perception had to change. And if you listen in the heat beneath tall teak, you might still hear the echo of skids, a blade's first bite, and a radio's dry voice saying, "Broadway open," a sentence that turned silence into strategy. The hush became a weapon. Japan never feared a wooden glider until silent Waco planes landed behind their lines,